Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" in two Gospels during the crucifixion. Where it appears in the Gospels, Matthew 27:46. And about the ninth hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" BibleStudyTools.com, BibleGateway.com. Mark 15:34. And at the ninth hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani?" which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" BibleHub.com, Crosswalk.com. Important note, this saying does not appear in Luke or John. Jesus is quoting Psalm 22:1, a well-known lament from the Hebrew Scriptures, which many scholars understand as pointing to the suffering of the Messiah. BibleStudyTools.com, GotQuestions.org. Matthew 27:46. And about the ninth hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" 47. And some of those who were standing there, when they heard it, said, "This man is calling for Elijah." 48. And immediately one of them ran, and taking a sponge, he filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed, and gave him a drink. 49. But the rest of them said, "One, let us see if Elijah comes to save him." 2. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice, and gave up his spirit. Mark 15:34. At the 1 and 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani?" which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me?" 35. And when some of the bystanders heard him, they began saying, "Look, he is calling for Elijah." 36. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave him a drink, saying, "One, let us see if Elijah comes to take him down." 37. But Jesus let out a loud cry and died, shavachthani, the Aramaic word for sakachthane, which translated means to abandon. This discussion ultimately raises two central questions. The first is why the Gospels of Luke and John do not include this saying. The second is what Yeshua was expressing or experiencing currently. This statement is reported to have occurred. It is particularly noteworthy that the Gospel of Luke, often regarded by scholars as the most historically careful and methodologically refined, does not include this verse in its crucifixion narrative. Scholarly consensus generally holds that Mark was the earliest gospel to be written, with Matthew subsequently drawing upon Mark while expanding and modifying its content. Luke, in turn, is traditionally understood to have relied on Mark, Matthew, and an additional source, commonly referred to as Q. Given Luke's reputation for accuracy and careful composition, the omission of this saying raises an important question. If Luke's gospel is indeed the most comprehensive and reliable synthesis of earlier traditions, why is this particular element absent from his account? This omission suggests that the saying may not have been universally accepted within early Christian traditions, or that Luke made a deliberate theological or narrative decision to exclude it. In either case, the absence invites closer scrutiny of both the historical authenticity of the statement and its theological significance within the broader gospel tradition. Original meaning implications and analysis. It appears that a significant number of people in churches today are reluctant to engage with the events surrounding Jesus' crucifixion. Rather than confronting sorrow or suffering, many prefer to focus exclusively on the joy of Easter Sunday morning. However, it is difficult to fully appreciate the significance of the resurrection and the empty tomb without first grappling with the sorrow and gravity of the crucifixion. Although this process is emotionally challenging, many individuals seem largely unconcerned with reflecting deeply on the events of the crucifixion. This reluctance may help explain why the crucifixion is not explored in depth within many church contexts, and as I discovered, not even in seminary education. My experience in seminary was shaped by the fact that I did not grow up within traditional church paradigms. I did not begin attending church services or Sunday school until the age of 35. As a result, when I encountered narratives that appeared inconsistent with established doctrine, I felt compelled to ask questions. During my first seminary experience, there was a formal review process in which students evaluated their ministry trajectory with an advisor and a faculty member. One criticism raised by the faculty was that I asked too many questions. In reality, the issue was not the quantity of questions, but rather that I posed questions for which they did not have satisfactory answers, despite their advanced academic credentials from institutions such as Yale, Harvard, and Duke. I also found that Christian doctrine and ritual practices frequently diverge from the scriptural text in ways too numerous to catalog comprehensively. Through an extensive investigation into the historical origins of Christian doctrines and rituals, I concluded that many of them closely resemble elements of the Mithraic religion, particularly its Persian form, with such parallels appearing in the majority of cases. Be that as it may, while attending a Good Friday service in 2026, particular emphasis was placed on Jesus' statement from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This moment prompted a renewed period of reflection and questioning. The first issue that arises is why this well-known saying appears in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, but not in Luke or John. As my research indicates, many church interpreters and commentators attempt to minimize this omission by suggesting that Luke and John convey essentially the same meaning through different wording. While this explanation is often accepted, it does not fully resolve the deeper theological concern. The more pressing question is not why the saying is absent from the other two Gospels, but rather what it signifies that Yeshua expressed a sense of being forsaken by God. One response I received from a theology professor during my first seminary experience raised further concerns, particularly in relation to Trinitarian doctrine, or at least as I understand it. The professor appealed to Christological doctrine, which holds that Yeshua is both fully human and fully divine. According to this framework, these two natures coexist within a single person. This explanation, however, introduces numerous complex questions that cannot be fully addressed here. For the sake of argument, let us provisionally accept this Christological definition. I was told that, while Jesus was on the cross, the divine aspect of his nature departed from him. Setting aside the physical body for a moment and focusing instead on the soul, this would suggest that Yeshua's soul was composed not only of the 5 levels traditionally described in Kabbalistic anthropology, but also included a divine component. I raise this point because if one follows the Christological explanation offered to me, the departure of the divine element could not have involved the physical body itself, since the body could not exist independently of one of its halves. Consequently, the divine element must be understood as departing at the level of soul or spirit rather than flesh. Under this interpretation, the divinity of Yeshua functioned as the divine spirit united with his soul, and its withdrawal would account for his experience of abandonment on the cross. This explanation, while not without difficulty, appears to align most closely with what I was told occurred during the crucifixion. Under this interpretation, the divine aspect of Yeshua would have been fully aware that his death, understood as a physical death, was imminent. For reasons ultimately unknown to us, this divine component was required to depart from him. For Yeshua, who had always experienced consciousness in union with the divine, such a sudden departure would have resulted in profound disorientation and bewilderment. In this state, he would have found himself alone within his body, prompting his anguished cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" At this point, one might argue that Yeshua did not literally utter these words, given that the saying does not appear in the Gospels of Luke or John, and that the authors of Matthew and Mark may have shaped the narrative to function as a prophetic statement affirming Yeshua's messianic identity by linking it to Psalm 22. However, this raises further interpretive concerns. Psalm 22, when examined in its original historical context, bears no direct reference to crucifixion or to Yeshua. It is a lament traditionally attributed to David during his time in the Judean wilderness, while fleeing from King Saul, who sought his life. It is therefore difficult to explain why David, under immediate threat centuries earlier, would be composing a text intended to predict words spoken by Yeshua on the cross. For this reason, the commonly asserted connection between Psalm 22 and the crucifixion may not be as definitive as often claimed, particularly given the strong interest of the authors of Matthew and Mark in establishing messianic continuity. It is also important to recall that determinations regarding which passages of the Hebrew Scriptures are considered messianic were largely shaped by later church theologians. When conducting research on messianic texts, one must therefore distinguish carefully between Jewish and Christian frameworks of interpretation. A general search for messianic passages will almost invariably reflect ecclesial conclusions rather than Jewish exegetical traditions. Returning to the crucifixion narrative, if Yeshua, in his humanity and with a fully human soul, experienced abandonment by the divine presence, his sense of anguish becomes intelligible. In this scenario, Yeshua finds himself alone on the cross, deprived of the divine component that had previously been integral to his identity. This interpretation, however, introduces several significant theological difficulties. The first issue that arose for me during my seminary studies concerns Trinitarian doctrine. Church theologians traditionally affirm that Yeshua is the second person of the Trinity and fully divine. If this is the case, it becomes difficult to explain how the divine could depart from him at the moment of crucifixion without undermining the claim that the entirety of the divine nature participated fully in his earthly life and death. This tension is further compounded by certain atonement theories promoted by the Church, which assert that God himself must die on the cross in order for humanity's sins to be forgiven. If the divine element withdrew before death, such claims appear to be theologically inconsistent. If the divine aspect of Yeshua departed before his death, then it follows that the divine did not experience death. Rather, it was the human Yeshua alone who died. Under this framework, atonement theories, particularly substitutionary atonement, become untenable. One cannot coherently claim that Yeshua, as a divine teacher, paid the penalty for human sin through death if the divine element withdrew before death actually occurred. Consequently, the Christian doctrine asserting that Yeshua experienced death on behalf of humanity appears to be fundamentally flawed. In this context, I am referring specifically to Yeshua as the divine second person of the Trinity. If the divine departed the human host before death and returned to heaven, then it cannot be said that the divine truly experienced death. This leads to a further theological problem. How was Yeshua seen alive 3 days later? If the divine Yeshua had already returned to the heavenly realm, who or what was encountered following the burial? According to the Gospel of John, Jesus instructs Mary not to touch him because he is in a state of transition, often translated as ascending or undergoing transformation. The implication is he was not fully physical at that moment, but existed in a spiritual or transfigured state. Yet 7 days later, he invites Thomas to touch him. This suggests that some form of transformation or transfiguration occurred during the intervening period, enabling physical interaction. This raises the critical question of whether the resurrection should be understood as the reanimation of dead flesh. If the divine aspect of Yeshua, the second person of the Trinity, had already departed, then what was experienced at the empty tomb and during the subsequent 40 days? One possible explanation is that what appeared was a cherubim, or high-ranking angelic being. According to angelological traditions, such beings are capable of assuming human form for limited periods of time. Support for this possibility is typically drawn from Genesis 6, verses 1 through 6, which describes the Watchers who descended to earth and united with human women, producing the Nephilim, or giants. For these angelic beings to engage in physical relations with humans, they would necessarily have had to assume corporeal form. If such a mechanism is possible within the biblical narrative, then it is conceivable that a similar transformation could have occurred in which the second person of the Trinity manifested in an angelic, corporeal form following the crucifixion. Under this interpretation, the figure witnessed on the third day was not the reanimated physical body of Yeshua, but rather a transformed divine or angelic manifestation capable of appearing human. Under this interpretation, the physical flesh of Yeshua did not persist beyond the crucifixion. What ultimately happened to his body remains unknown. John Dominic Crossan, in Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography, speculates on the fate of Yeshua's remains, offering a historically and culturally plausible explanation grounded in Roman burial practices. Crossan himself acknowledges that his proposal is speculative rather than definitive, yet it remains a serious historical consideration and is worth consulting independently. Regardless of the precise fate of the physical body of Yeshua of Nazareth, the more pressing question remains: what did Mary encounter on Easter morning? Under the framework developed here, it was not the reanimated human body of Yeshua, but rather the divine aspect of Yeshua returning from heaven in an angelic form, one capable of assuming the properties of human flesh. Notably absent from the scriptural record is any explanation for why this angelic manifestation of Yeshua could remain present for no longer than 40 days. Within biblical symbolism, however, the number 40 often signifies a period of preparation or completion. From this perspective, Ascension Day, occurring 40 days after Easter, takes on particular theological significance. It marks the point at which Yeshua determined that his earthly instruction was complete and that it was time for him to depart. An important secondary question arises from this interpretation. Why has Yeshua not returned in angelic form to address the profound disorder of the world? Not only is the world itself deeply fractured, but the church established in his name is likewise in disarray. Yeshua did not advocate division, yet beginning as early as 48 CE, particularly through the theological conflicts involving Paul and Peter, division became a defining characteristic of Christianity. This issue, however, lies beyond the scope of the present discussion. What remains, then, is a fundamental theological problem. Who actually died on the cross, and who or what was raised 3 days later? If the divine aspect of Yeshua departed before his death, then that divine aspect could not have been raised from the dead. The reason is straightforward. The divine, having already returned to heaven, did not experience death and therefore could not undergo resurrection. Resurrection presupposes death, and under this model, death was experienced solely by the human Yeshua, not by the divine second person of the Trinity. Some may object at this point by appealing to the claim that Yeshua descended into hell to battle Satan and secure final victory. However, this assertion is not explicitly stated anywhere in the biblical text. Despite its presence in later creedal formulations and theological traditions, it lacks direct scriptural support. Moreover, if Yeshua's resurrection is intended to demonstrate his definitive victory over Satan, it is difficult to reconcile that claim with the persistent and pervasive presence of evil in the world, not only in the present day, but throughout the more than 2 millennia since these events. Satan, by all observable accounts, appears neither defeated nor inactive in world affairs. In a separate theological position paper, I have suggested an alternative possibility: that the divine spirit of Yeshua departed from the physical body at death, but remained in proximity, observing how events unfolded and how individuals responded. On the third day, when the women came to the tomb in accordance with customary practice, the divine spirit may have assumed a corporeal form to appear to them. The question of why the women went to Yeshua's tomb on the third day is one that Christianity often struggles to explain, largely because it has distanced itself from its Hebraic roots. In the ancient Near East, it was customary on the third day after death to visit the grave of a deceased loved one and speak to them. Although no response was expected, it was believed that the soul remained near the body until the third day and could hear what was spoken. Within certain Jewish traditions, including Kabbalistic thought, the soul is understood to be confused during the first 3 days after death, not yet comprehending its transition. Kabbalistic sources further suggest that the soul ultimately ascends to the heavenly realms, often described symbolically as the lower waters of the tree of life, sometime between 3 and 365 days after death, with most souls departing by the 4th day. This belief sheds light on the narrative of Yeshua raising Lazarus from the dead. The significance of Lazarus being raised on the 4th day lies precisely in the assumption that, by that time, the soul would ordinarily have already departed. The miracle, therefore, carries greater theological weight within a Jewish conceptual framework. Having laid out this analysis, drawing on Christian scholarship, linguistic considerations, and the cultural and religious customs of the period, we are left to ask what conclusion can reasonably be drawn. Unfortunately, the conclusion that emerges does not align with established Christian doctrine, nor will it be found in standard Christian interpretations or commentaries. Nonetheless, it follows logically from the historical, textual, and theological considerations presented here. Under the Christological framework, in which Yeshua is understood as fully human and fully divine, often described as a unity of two natures, it follows that Yeshua did not experience death in the same way humanity does. If the divine component departed before the death of the physical body, then the divine did not undergo death. Consequently, Yeshua, understood as a divine entity, did not experience our death. This conclusion would necessitate a substantial revision of core Christian doctrine. What occurred on Easter Sunday, under this interpretation, was not the resurrection of physical flesh. Rather, Mary and the disciples encountered the divine Yeshua manifested in an angelic form. The physical body did not return to life, and its fate remains unknown, assuming that Yeshua was indeed placed in a tomb. As previously noted, John Dominic Crossan offers a markedly different historical reconstruction regarding what may have happened to the body. The belief that Yeshua, both divine and human, died, was buried, and rose bodily on the 3rd day rests fundamentally on faith transmitted by ecclesial tradition over the course of more than 2 millennia. This belief is not derived solely from historical or textual certainty, but from doctrinal continuity shaped by the Church. To explore the origins of this belief, one must examine the Mithraic religion, which was widespread throughout the Roman Empire, particularly in its Persian form in the Near East. Within Mithraism, Mithras is portrayed as dying for the salvation of his followers, undergoing death in a manner strikingly similar to the biblical depiction of Yeshua, and rising again after 3 days. These parallels warrant serious scholarly attention. Readers interested in a more detailed exploration of this relationship may consult my work, Christianity's Need for Mithras. Much of what humanity believes about God is ultimately grounded in faith. There are many phenomena that resist full explanation, yet continue to function meaningfully within belief systems. If one holds, by faith, that Yeshua, both divine and human, died on the cross, was buried, and rose bodily on the 3rd day, that position remains valid as an expression of faith. However, in light of Yeshua's statement that he had been forsaken by God, maintaining such a belief may present significant theological tension. A common response to this tension is the harmonization of the gospel accounts. Through harmonization, one can affirm that Yeshua, in both his divine and human nature, died, was buried, and rose again. While such harmonization preserves doctrinal consistency, it may also obscure unresolved contradictions within the texts themselves. It is important to distinguish clearly between academic research and faith. What is held as an article of faith is not always identical to what can be demonstrated historically or academically. Christianity, over the course of its history, has undergone numerous revisions, additions, and adaptations as it absorbed the cultures of diverse peoples across the world. As a result, it has become increasingly difficult to recover what the earliest followers of Yeshua actually believed at the time of his death. One final point deserves attention. The Church often emphasizes that the disciples scattered following the death of Jesus. and this observation is historically accurate. However, the disciples are frequently criticized or morally judged for doing so. Within the cultural context of Yeshua's time, this reaction was entirely normative. When a leader was executed for promoting teachings deemed unacceptable by the Sanhedrin, his followers were expected to disperse immediately. This was not an act of cowardice, nor did it reflect a lack of faith or loyalty. Rather, it was a practical response rooted in the fear of arrest, trial, and execution. Cultural norms demanded temporary separation and disappearance for survival. There are many instances in which biblical texts have been interpreted in ways that diverge from their original meaning, particularly after Christianity moved away from its Hebraic roots. It is my hope that this examination, grounded in academic research, will encourage readers to pursue the original context of Scripture by engaging more deeply with the language, culture, and worldview of Yeshua's time.